Alrighty, we'll get started here and we'll have some people filter in as we get started up front. Good evening / good afternoon, wherever you are in this fine country. My name is Zane Velji. I'm the campaign director for Vote Housing, the national nonpartisan housing campaign that we have been running leading up to and now during this federal election. Thank you for joining us this evening for this federal election town hall with Edmonton Mayor Don Iveson. We're very excited for the conversation. Very excited to hear your questions. I'll get into some of the housekeeping in a second here about what we're up to. But what I'll say up front is that we find ourselves in a very interesting time right now. You know, when we started this campaign a little while ago, who knew that housing would be such a upfront issue in this election? And there's a lot of momentum behind the conversation that we are going to have today, and we're very, very excited to have it. Let me give you a brief summary of what we're about to do today. We'll do a bit of an update on the Vote Housing campaign, and then we'll jump right into it with our town hall with Mayor Iveson. What I will say is you can ask questions with the Q&A tab that you'll see on your screen. So feel free to jump in with those questions, during the conversation that Mayor Iveson and I will have up front. We'll get to your questions as soon as possible, and we'll try to power through as many as we can. So please feel free to ask questions. Also, as many of you have already been doing, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're from, what brings you here today. The more we get to know each other through the confines of this and other events, that the community we are forming with Vote Housing becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. We also have simultaneous interpretation. So for those that are French language speaking, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that little globe. If you click on that and you go to French, you'll be able to hear this entire conversation simultaneously interpreted in French for you, which is also available. So we're looking forward to having everyone be able to participate and engage in this evening's conversation. Before I get started, I do want to have and make a quick land acknowledgement and have a moment for that as well. So let me quickly do that here. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We recognize the historic and ongoing impacts of colonization and are committed to decolonization of our systems and ongoing reconciliation, guided in our work by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the TRC calls to action, the MMIWG calls to justice, and the principles of empowerment and self-determination. Vote Housing and all our partners are committed to equity, dignity, justice, and belonging. We're dedicated to serving equity-seeking communities as anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and inclusive allies. So wherever you are in this country, wherever this conversation finds you today, we wanted to make that land acknowledgement possible and really ensure that we acknowledge it up front prior to our conversation. So let me jump into the main part of my update, which is something you are not here to listen to, but I think is so germane to the conversation we're about to have. And that is this campaign. And this campaign, Vote Housing, started out with a very simple goal and born out of a very complicated need. And that need was that housing and homelessness as we know it, major and mass housing deficits and homelessness as we know it in this country, are a direct result of public policy. More specifically, a direct result of inaction from federal parties and federal engagement on those policies. So our mission in this campaign, this nonpartisan national campaign, was to ensure that we get involved in politics, that we use politics as a mechanism to change the policies. We know that federal governments in the past have weighed in, have invested in affordable housing, and we know that our voice and our ongoing broad coalition will be the way that, or at least one of the ways, that ensures that they come back to the table and continue making those investments. And what we're seeing in this election is that housing has bubbled up as a key issue, that the conversation, I'd say, is louder than it ever has been at the federal level. And part of that is because of the affordability conversation, but part of that is also about the conversation on the housing spectrum, and we'll get into that with Mayor Iveson in a second as well. So our mission has been quite simply to build this very large coalition of organizations and individuals across the country so that any political party, and frankly, anyone who gets into government, has to go through us as it relates to housing, affordable housing, and homelessness issues in this country. And a couple of things that we've been up to. We recently released our federal election platform called Solvable. One of the biggest things for this campaign is to not just say that there's a huge problem, that we have a crisis, and we do. It is a big problem, and we are in a crisis. That we've got something that's evidence-based, that we have an ability to change these things. So we released our platform. We've also are hosting a national housing debate coming up on Tuesday. Representatives from all five major political parties have confirmed their attendance. We've got moderators from major news outlets across the country hosting a national housing debate. As the issue has increased in salience during this election, we want to ensure that there is a robust, necessary conversation with all political parties on it as well. And then finally, another sort of initiative we launched a couple of days ago, late last week, which really had its crescendo today, was a mini campaign called Rent is Due. And this is a sobering fact that 5 million Canadians today, 5 million people had anxiety today about how they would pay their rent today on September the 1st. And let's just think about that for a second. That's 5 million people. That's the population of the Toronto, main Toronto area, Vancouver, Calgary combined. If every person in those three cities had anxiety about paying their rent today, 5 million Canadians. And we know that this is a startling fact. We know that it is indicative and illustrative of the larger rental housing crisis that we face in this country. And it's something we want to ensure that we highlight, not just for this September 1st, but going forward as our momentum and initiative and organizing and advocacy continue to really ensure that political parties and whoever forms government understands that the housing spectrum, especially for those experiencing homelessness and live in precarious housing situations, needs to be resolved and needs to be resolved quickly. The final thing I'll do before I introduce Mayor Iveson here is just give you an update on some of our stats. And when I say our stats, I mean top line. And one of the things that we are really proud of in this campaign is our goal was to go out and form a coalition of everyday people from all walks of life. And I can faithfully say we've got tens of thousands of people across the country that have joined this campaign. We've now got over 200 organizations representing hundreds of thousands of people, board, staff, volunteers, members that have joined the campaign. We know that by engaging in this election, we have created a force, that this is not the end, but this is actually just the beginning in many ways of this coalition, of this group of people, like-minded from all corners of this country, wanting to ensure that we end homelessness, that we end housing need in this country, and we do it through our voice, and we do it in this particular election through our votes. And so we're very, very excited about this growth in this campaign, and frankly, I'd say all of you have been an instrumental part of getting us there. Okay, without further ado, I now want to introduce our guest here, Mayor Don Iveson. Since his election as Edmonton's 35th mayor in 2013, Mayor Iveson has led Edmonton's transformation into a more uplifting, resilient, and globally competitive city. Mayor Iveson's guiding leadership principle is to make things better for the next generation. Despite tough economic headwinds, he works every day to connect Edmontonians to collaboratively make progress on Council's 4 strategic priorities: building a healthier and more inclusive city, building a more prosperous and economically diverse region, responding to the climate emergency, and building a more urbanized place, a cost-effective and sustainable city as we grow to 2 million people, all while working to strengthen the integrity and performance at City Hall. Mayor Don Iveson has served on Edmonton City Council for 13 years. He was first elected as a city councillor for Ward 5 in 2007. Prior to entering public life, Iveson studied political science at the University of Alberta, then served as president of Canadian University Press in Toronto. He returned home to a city that appeared to be exporting young, smart leaders and thinkers, creators, and entrepreneurs faster than it could attract them. The challenge of attracting and retaining this talent inspired Mayor Iveson to run for city council in 2007. And as a result, one of his key performance indicators as both a father and as a mayor is to build the kind of city where when the time comes, his kids will decide to stay and build. So without further ado, please help me welcome Mayor Don Iveson. Hello, Mayor.
Thanks, Zane. Boy, that was the long intro, but
it was the long intro. It was a long but necessary intro, and you know why? Because I will start here for our conversation. And what I will say to everyone is, please, enter your questions in the chat. But I wanted to start here, Mayor, which was to say thank you. You announced earlier this year that you are not seeking re-election. 13 years on council. As a public servant, many years, I shouldn't say on the sidelines, but trying to ensure that even outside of council, building a better city. So I wanted to say thank you for your public service, because I know firsthand from folks that I've talked to, that I've dealt with, that it's not an easy thing, and it is really a sacrifice. So thank you for all your public service that you've committed thus far, and I hope it's not the last time we see you on the public stage in that regard.
Well, thanks, Zane. I might or might not have a couple more elections in me, but I definitely need a breather after the last 4. So, but this is an issue that we're here to talk about today that has really wormed its way into my heart, and so I'm glad to be here today, supporting the Vote Housing campaign and talking about housing policy, and looking forward to taking some questions from people. It's nice to see you as well. So thanks for your commitment and leadership on this file.
Let's talk about the fact that you just mentioned, which is about it kind of wormed its way into your heart. You recently wrote an op-ed for the Edmonton Journal, which was published a couple days ago. And I want to read folks the first 2 lines of that, or the first 2 sections of that, because it was incredibly powerful. I'm just going to quote you. It said, "Not long after my election 14 years ago, I nearly stepped over my best friend from junior high. I was walking near City Hall amidst the housing affordability crisis of boomtime Alberta. He was slumped over on a sidewalk, clearly in distress. We'd lost touch, and I was sad to see that after his time on the streets, he looked about 10 years older than me. It's too easy to judge people who are struggling and make all kinds of assumptions. But knowing something of my friend's story helped me to nurture compassion for him and humanize others experiencing hardships on our streets." Perhaps starting with this story and kind of leading to your action and commitment on this file, what has this crisis of homelessness kind of taught you about the depths of the problem, but perhaps even with the successes that Edmonton has experienced, also the viability of the solutions that we have at our disposal?
I think obviously it's personal for me, and it's become more so as I've met more people in our community who have lived experience with homelessness, both those people still enduring it, who I've had many opportunities to connect with. Lots of folks before the pandemic would gather and pass the day at City Hall or at the Civic Library across the square. And so I've had the opportunity to chat with lots of people about their experiences and about the gaps in the systems that aren't serving them very well, but also the parts of the system that do work well, and particularly some of the issues with our shelter system, which is not sufficiently housing focused yet. It's still sort of managing the problem in a lot of cases. But when I rewind back to that time, it was right about the same time that my predecessor, Mayor Mandel, was working very, very closely with Premier Stelmach to deal with, in the midst of Alberta's huge housing affordability challenges and housing pinch. We had real supply challenges, or demand exceeding supply anyway, and lots of people left on the margins. We had a surge in addictions issues around that time too, because there was a lot of money in circulation. And so for various reasons, the crisis was at a bit of a peak in 2006, 2007. And so there was what I saw then, which gave me some hope in retrospect, looking back on it now, was many actors coming together, civil society leaders, faith community leaders, agency partners, and government leaders coming together and saying, we need to solve this issue. And this was happening both in Edmonton and Calgary. And Alberta deserves a lot of credit for really helping to kickstart some of the strong leadership and consensus, modeling on what had worked well in other parts of the world, including parts of the United States, taking a housing first approach and instead of sort of making housing the finish line to the old model was, get clean, get a job, and then we'll get you housing and you can move out of the shelter. Well, it's really hard to do that, and that model doesn't work. And so getting folks housing with embedded supports does work, not 100% of the time, but more than 80% of the time. Folks stay housed with the right supports in place around them, and the folks who aren't getting the right supports at this point. So basically, the mindset shift was, this is not an intractable societal ill that will always be there. This is a solvable challenge with root causes to prevent, interventions that are evidence-based, and oh, by the way, and this is why it got such broad traction across all parts of the political spectrum at the time, was it's going to save us all a bunch of money as well. Like, there's more efficient outcomes to be had here for people who are struggling, as well as for all of us who are chipping in to pay for a system that is reacting rather than preventing and solving. And so that mindset shift from managing it to ending it, and getting all of the individual life by life benefits and all of the cumulative societal benefits was the mindset shift that was happening in Edmonton and Calgary and 5 other large centers in Alberta, with leadership and partnership from the government of Alberta. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that same level of collaboration and cooperation today. But in spite of that, we've made huge progress showing that it is possible to substantially bring down homelessness in urban settings in this country. And in Medicine Hat, one of the 7 cities that originally set out on that goal together more than a decade ago, they've achieved that zero functional homelessness, which is to say, not that no one becomes homeless in Medicine Hat, but it is brief and non-recurring and rare that happens there. And that is an achievable goal across this country, I truly believe. And so that's why I'm going to carry on in this work even beyond being mayor. But certainly in my time here at City Hall, it's been a big focus of my work and part of my leadership with the big city mayors nationally as well.
Can you reflect on that? Because you talked about the mindset shift, and it led to some significant success. Like, you're from 2009 to 2020, the overall reduction of homelessness by 43% in Edmonton, the best of any large city in Canada. When I read you that stat, and as you approach the finish line of your mayorship, how does that sit with you when you reflect upon that?
Well, I mean, I think about my friend, and as one example, and many other people who I've met who've benefited from supportive housing, whose lives have been saved, whose quality of life has been improved. And I can extrapolate from that at the systems level to say, the 12,900 or so people we've housed using Housing First over that period of time are in way better shape, for the most part, than if our society hadn't come together, and if programs of cooperation between and among governments and agencies wasn't in place. We'd be in a much worse situation as a community, and those individuals would be in a much worse situation. Many of them would not be alive. And so this is life-saving work. But it is also meaning not just reduced human suffering, but reduced interaction with the healthcare system in particular, which is a huge, cost and question of sustainability. We care as Canadians about our public healthcare system, of course. So let's make sure we're using its scarce resources wisely, not responding to preventable, repeated human tragedy that's associated with street-involved lifestyle. And likewise, then interactions with the justice system, and then challenges with disorder on our streets. And as the addictions profile has changed over that time, and sadly, meth has become much more prevalent. You see very erratic behaviors from individuals who are struggling, and that is a challenge to the public. It is a challenge to first responders. It is a challenge to shopkeepers and other folks trying to maintain a sense of welcome and order in our business districts. And so, all to say, that's all preventable. That's all avoidable. You just have to muster the resources into the right place. And there's still a financing gap, because the business case is very, very strong. The challenge is it takes a few years to sort of, and we don't have a good mechanism between the orders of government to claw back those benefits against the upfront costs. But we've seen such a significant shift and such momentum building towards this that I do think it's only a matter of time, particularly now that the government in the throne speech last year committed to a goal of ending chronic homelessness, and Liberals have it explicitly in their platform. I believe the New Democrats agree. I think the Conservatives understand the fiscal case behind it. It's a question of prioritization. So I think there is an advancing national consensus around this, at least in federal politics, certainly among mayors, and not just of the big cities, but rural mayors, leaders of communities who work closely with Indigenous communities nearby. There's a very strong public policy consensus everywhere except a number of provincial legislatures where there's still some work to do.
You know, you talked about this consensus, and I want you to hold on to that thought about big city mayors and frankly the just rural mayors you've talked to, and how housing might be becoming a broader sort of conversation point of consensus. But let's kind of move to the federal scene that you were talking about, which is, you know, we're seeing political parties talk about homelessness. Housing has kind of, you know, become a campaign issue. I think I can legitimately say it's become a big campaign issue this cycle. You know, we've talked about on this campaign that policy is what got us here, and, you know, using our voice and votes to ensure that we are engaged in politics is what gets us out of this, is that federal leadership on this file is necessary. I just want you to reflect maybe on that, which is, why do you think federal leadership is so critical for those experiencing housing precarity or homelessness in this country?
Well, I'll answer that two ways. I mean, first, just something else I want to say about mindset, which is critical to making sure that mindset exists at the federal level, is once you've accepted the premise that maybe ending it's possible, and I believe there's plenty of evidence to show it, and there's practical examples of it, then I think it gets very hard to take the position that a certain amount of it is tolerable. Because you know, there are folks running for mayor in Edmonton right now, for example, to succeed here, who say, well, you can't really end it, right? To which my question back is, well, what amount of homelessness is acceptable to you in our community? How can you justify that position, right? So there is a mindset shift there, and it is a question of justice, and it is a question of values. And I think that is at the deepest level, one of the questions we ask ourselves as Canadians with every election is, what are our values on these things? And I think we saw during the pandemic that, you know, there was tremendous empathy. I mean, we were all struggled to some degree with the challenges of the pandemic, but I think it was just understood clearly and implicitly that folks on our streets were literally the most precarious in terms of their economic circumstances and their public health circumstances, especially during the winter. And so we saw finally unprecedented mobilization across all orders of government to try to solve this. Now, we only did that for one winter. We've got to carry that sense of urgency through not just this election, but through the many years of sustained effort and commitment that would be necessary to deliver on this goal. And so it's great to have this national commitment in the federal Liberal platform, for example, and in the throne speech last year. But what we need now beyond the general commitment is a specific timeline and allocation of resources that everybody can get behind. And the other answer I would give to your question is that just think what we could have accomplished in Alberta 13 years ago when Ed Stelmach said, we have a 10-year plan to end homelessness. And they put $800 or $900 million on the table. Edmonton and Calgary and other municipalities put, even though it's not even our jurisdiction, we put land and money on the table. And we made good progress without any presence from the national government at all, which has the deepest purse strings on this, and actually gives a ton of money to provinces for healthcare and social services without expecting much in the way of outcomes. And so I do think now having a federal government of whatever stripe engaged on housing again changes the game, fundamentally changes the game. Having cities engaged obviously is helpful. Getting provinces aligned to it, that will be the last piece of the puzzle. But I think we could have solved homelessness already here in Alberta if all three orders of government had been pulling together that whole time.
And so I see questions coming in the chat, so I will encourage folks, if you have questions, please type them in. I'm going to get them to in a second, right after this question, which is a follow-up to what you said here, Mayor, which is, you're right. We do have multiple parties willing to be at the table to invest their capital, their energy, their frankly, their political will in this. if I can ask you, is there a policy in your mind that you feel like the federal government should be the top of the heap for them? I know in our platform, if you go to votehousing.ca/solvable, you'll see the 6 platform ideas we're talking about. But is there one in your mind that you feel like the federal government needs to tomorrow run with as something they have to execute and do?
Well, I think the Rapid Housing Initiative, which worked directly with municipalities and agencies to deliver more housing, has been phenomenally successful. There's 9,000 units of housing that can be delivered through the first and second round of it so far. But I think the next thing that, and I've been urging the Prime Minister and the key ministers on this file to think about, this is a little bit controversial, is to say the federal government needs to begin to expect some outcomes for the more than $50 billion a year it sends in the health and social transfers to provinces. And particularly if provinces are not willing to work with local governments, agency partners, and the federal government to achieve national goals around reducing and ending homelessness, then in essence, the position they're taking is that they're okay with these avoidable costs, particularly in the health system and the justice system. And why Canadian taxpayers from coast to coast to coast should pay for bad outcomes for provinces, particularly on the health side, that we know are avoidable, while the federal government is trying to push money out the door as part of stimulus and economic relief. That's created an issue for us here in Edmonton, where under the Rapid Housing Initiative, we had shovel-ready projects ready to go, $68 million worth of projects for 420 units of housing would have created much needed COVID recovery jobs. And we were declined because the government of Alberta wouldn't agree to fund the lights on funding for those projects, to embed the social workers and healthcare workers and cultural support workers to help people stay housed, which again would save the government of Alberta money. And so we left federal aid on the table, which usually Alberta is complaining we don't get enough help from Ottawa. In this case, we didn't do the simple thing, which was take the $100 on construction, agree to the lights on money, and get the benefits. So those units are being built in other parts of the country now. And through a different stream of that program, we're still building over 300 units and converting hotels and doing other things that we can. But we're now having to turn the lights on in those projects. We're now having to divert Reaching Home dollars programs, dollars for Housing First programs into those lights on. Now, long term, you wouldn't need as much frontline intervention because you'd be funding more supports. But again, there's a timing issue on all of this. So I think the federal government attaching some conditionality, and this is not me responding to anybody's platform, this is just my bugbear for a while, that as Canadians, we really should get alignment from all orders of government and some agreement on these goals. So that's where the federal government could flex the power of the purse to make sure that we're attacking this goal from coast to coast to coast in a unified way.
You speak of the Rapid Housing Initiative. I'm going to go to Cheryl's question here, which we have. She says, I sit on Regina City Council, and our city just applied for the federal Rapid Housing Initiative funding. One of the concerns is that there's an absence of provincial funding for programming, so it falls on the city to fund this. How can cities better leverage funding to support the Housing First initiatives?
Well, that's exactly the situation that we found ourselves in here. And I think it's one of the questions that we need to take back through organizations like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and then in turn through our provincial associations to put pressure on our provincial governments to do better in this regard, because it is the big gap. Not universally. I mean, there are some provinces who are gobbling up these resources, and they're going to be better for it on all the outcomes that I talked about earlier. And so I think we've got to sustain pressure. One thing we've done in Edmonton here is really broaden out the coalition, because I think folks are getting tired of hearing me talking about housing issues. And so it was getting our faith community leaders, our business community leaders, and others involved in making the case to the government of Alberta in terms that they might listen to. And so those broad societal coalitions of consensus around issues of justice and better public policy outcomes, I think that's our only way forward here. But again, the federal government attaching conditions, us urging through groups like FCM, the federal government, to expect better outcomes for the dollars it sends. And certainly if there are top-ups to, say, mental health supports to provinces, which in just about everybody's platform is, let's give provinces, let's invest more in mental health, because our mental health circumstances were strained before the pandemic and are worse now. But it's not it's not a stretch to say, and by the way, some of that should be delivered through embedded services in the supportive housing, which we're paying for here under the Rapid Housing Initiative. So again, I think pressure needs to come from all directions: civil society, local governments, and from national outcomes and conditionality on those dollars coming from Ottawa.
Can I just ask you point blank, we're talking about housing in the federal election. Did it surprise you, of course, as a big city mayor, as someone who's been a political watcher, that housing has become such a big and loud issue in this federal election?
No, I mean, I think partly because housing's an issue for us all the time. So we're like, welcome to the party, really.
Yeah. Exactly, right.
But I am really pleased that it's broken out to be, I think table stakes, at least, if not one of the ballot questions for many Canadians. I think it's a bit double-edged. We've seen that happen in Alberta before, again, back in the example I was talking about from more than a decade ago, because it tends to very quickly become a question about housing for the middle class, where the votes are. And no doubt there are structural changes happening in the housing market, issues of flipping and vacancies that need to be managed, speculators that need to be regulated differently, tax measures, and a variety of other things that are in various parties' platforms to address some of those issues around the general housing market, as well as mortgage financing and homeowner attainability. And I think all those things are good, but they are a little bit distinct from the acute need of the housing spectrum that we're talking about here, which, as long as that doesn't fall off the table, I think it's fine to say, as a country, one of our goals fundamentally is everyone has a place to live. I mean, we are a winter country. The idea that people do not have homes here at all is mystifying in other parts of the world, and yet we've accepted it for a long time. So if the broader consensus is everybody at every stage of life, at every income level, deserves at least a stable place to call home, and if we have the consensus that that's better for the economy, it's better for the sustainability of public services, and it's just, then that would be a good place to wind up. And then you'd see, the mortgage measures, the speculator tax measures, and the affordable housing interventions, the partnerships. And there's a lot around, the other thing that has come up quite a bit that I'm pleased to see, and the mayors have been pushing on this for a while, is maintenance of the affordable housing, rental housing stock, and reinvestment in the existing social housing stock, because not at the end where we're talking about here supportive housing for people with more complex challenges contributing to their homelessness, but just up from that, where are the gaps and bottlenecks in the system that people are falling through to come into homelessness? So you've got to address the entire spectrum. And that is on the table in the various announcements from the various parties to varying degrees. But a number of the commitments in the platforms are responding to where Canadians are at, which is concerned about either their own housing affordability. You mentioned the 5 million people concerned about making rent this month. A lot of Canadians are, in a good position themselves, but worried about their kids' own ability to either attain home ownership or find housing at all in tight rental markets. So it is a broad issue, and I'm glad it's come to the fore in the context of this election.
Yeah, and I'm glad you answered it in that way, because that's exactly where I wanted to go. And frankly, it's exactly where Tyler and Jean's question is as well, which is talking about the housing spectrum, right? We've seen a lot of conversation about, to your point, the middle class home ownership. And I think it's opened the door for the first time on the federal election sort of sphere and platform to talk about the housing spectrum and what it means. And there's an opening here. From your perspective, how do you think we kind of pivot the conversation or keep the attention on that acute population that this campaign, that Vote Housing, about housing precarity and homelessness, is focused on?
Well, that's where I'm really glad that the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has come together with this campaign with with other housing advocates to make the case and make sure that this issue doesn't fall off the table. So for people who are passionate about this, who've tuned in today, I salute you and thank you for your leadership. I see a few people from Edmonton too, who I know, a longtime city councilor, one of my mentors, Michael Fair, who taught me a few of the things that I'm saying now over the years, and has done a ton of work with groups like End Poverty Edmonton here. And so keeping that focus up with civil society and having a campaign like this that's consistent across the country, that gives people simple tools to communicate this. I think that's the mobilization that we need to make sure that vulnerable people's issues are not just being talked about in general terms by policymakers, but that both vulnerable people themselves and with self-advocacy and with amplification like this through sharing of their lived experience, which is important, but also, allies and advocates have the opportunity to sing from a consistent song sheet and defend and promote the premise that this is a solvable challenge and that there are broad benefits to doing it. And so I think mobilization like this is critical to that, and I think it's also one of the reasons why I've joined the board of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, because I want to contribute to that effort ongoing and continue to make the case not just through the election, but then to hold whoever does end up in government and in Parliament and in leadership accountable to the promises and the commitments that they made, and continue to make the case that that this is worth doing and not dropping a ball. So that's where I, as an advocate and as an ally, I definitely take on the responsibility. But I don't feel alone knowing that there's so many other people passionate about this, right?
Yeah, I know, and that's excellent in both the long term and frankly the short term of this election cycle, where we've got people from across the country engaged and wanting to kind of draw change, ensure that the focal point of the housing conversation is exactly on what we've discussed. I might take a quick pivot for a second to talk a little bit about advocacy, because we've brought it up in the confines of mobilizing and conversation. I think you hold a very interesting position because, you of course get advocated to often as a mayor of a big city, but a large part of your job is advocating to different orders of government about the needs of your city and your constituents. So, the rare elected official's eye view of advocacy and lobbying for change, what advice would you have to our supporters, whether it's the ones that are on this webinar that might be listening to it their own in? What have you found effective? What kind of resonates with elected people? We've got a suite of tactics that we're pushing on, and I'll say this election, but well beyond, because we're trying to build a community and a movement. But I'm curious to get your unique vantage point to advocacy and what you found to work either for yourself or what's kind of worked in that regard that from organizations that have been able to affect change during your time as an elected official.
Well, I still feel kind of old school because I came to City Hall 14 years ago now, thinking, with all my high school and university debate training, that all you needed was a really good argument and good evidence.
Right.
And that's table stakes for sure. And I know we've got a great case, whether you call it, whether it's a moral case or a business case. I know the case is sound here. We've got to keep making it though. So that's the first lesson, is perseverance and patience. And somebody told me once about advocacy, just about the time that you are sick and tired of hearing yourself talk about something is about where it might be getting through. Right. And then from the perspective of having been in receipt of advocacy, it is persistence and consistency that gets through over time, even if your case is already really strong, right? Because, we are on the receiving end of so much different public input, and often at different perspectives. And so you've got to be a bit relentless, and that requires a lot of patience. So it is a long game that way. I think the other thing I would say, in addition to patience and having a solid case, is that you do have to build relationships. And one of my city council colleagues, Scott McKean, who's done a lot of leadership on housing, has a really interesting take on this, which is and the tenor of advocacy around these issues has shifted. And it's sort of the Harvey Dent issue. If you either die a hero or stick around long enough to become the villain, right? And as with our encampments and other challenges that we faced, sometimes we're easily seen as not doing enough or contributing to the problem, right? And so this is a really challenging thing, especially when there seems to be such moral clarity on a question, is maintaining relationships with the ultimate decision makers is sort of the difference between performative activism, which is important. It's part of the democratic process too. But ultimately, real change at the level of getting the program details right and right-sizing the program, that's still got to be relationship-based. And you can't shame someone into making the right decision, or it's really, really hard to unless you have massive public pressure on your side. And so the fine art of working with people and being patient and having a good case takes a lot of perseverance and a lot of organization. But when you have a movement like this that has been building for years with housing advocates across the country who have made this mindset shift from managing a challenge to solving it, you know, there is momentum there. I've seen it grow and build over time. So I still have hope in this, notwithstanding that I sometimes feel sick of hearing myself talk about housing issues. But I think that means we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, yeah. And keeping it just, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about in the campaign is how do we just keep volleying it in the conversation? How do we ensure that it just stays top of mind, that it doesn't die out, that it keeps there, and just sustaining it in the communal sort of conversation, at least within the confines of this election, there on in, is a marker of success. That the more people are talking about it, the more they're exploring it, the more, you know, we have an opportunity to start penetrating and building greater strength and success in the movement and the advocacy. I want to go to Paul's question here, and he's talking about how would you encourage municipalities around density issues? I think, you know, part of what Paul's asking here is perhaps the stigma of affordable housing, the NIMBYism that might come with it. I suspect it's been a challenge during your time on council as well as mayor. Any answer you might have to Paul regarding affordable housing? Because we've seen the two sides of this conversation come up, even in this election, where, you know, some groups saying this is exactly what we need. Almost all major political parties saying yes, more affordable housing of some kind. But then that's other sliver of the conversation that we've seen on municipal levels around NIMBYism and not in my backyard. So curious to hear some of your thoughts and perhaps even experiences as related to Paul's question here around the stigma of affordable housing, so to speak.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that we've worked through here in Edmonton, and I wouldn't tell you that we've solved it outright, but we've taken a couple of different approaches to it. One, overall, as part of our city's sustainability objectives and planning objectives, you know, we put a big emphasis on a lot more densification and renewal of the city for all the good reasons of sustainability, financial and environmental, as well as social determinants of health and population health outcomes. But it just so happens that with that, you know, you're going to be developing more medium density housing, and some of that needs to be affordable housing. And so one of the things that we've done is stipulate that we're going to not over concentrate in any one neighborhood affordable housing, because you can create poverty traps and other challenges and issues of over concentration. There is some evidence to that effect. And some of that's driven by stigma, and some of it is issues where you can create diversity issues in a neighborhood if there aren't people of multiple sort of socioeconomic statuses. And so all that to say, you know, we have a distribution philosophy. So we've been looking for sites around the city so that we have affordable housing ultimately in all of our neighborhoods. And that, practically speaking, what that meant is that every councillor is going to take some, so that it's not all in some other councillor's ward. And so that there was a bit of a brokerage around that and buy into that principle. And then the other thing that we've done is some regulatory changes that affect the whole marketplace. But for example, some of the streamlining that we've done is the removal of parking minimums. And you know, it's silly. We've got some great housing projects and communities here in the city that have zoning bylaw stipulated underground parking, which some of the staff use, but otherwise sits empty and gets used for storage. And now, if you're building a community that doesn't need housing because the community members don't own cars, then you don't have that cost anymore. And so that contributes to the relative affordability of housing in the general marketplace as we shift to less car dependency generally as part of our city plan, but specifically at the most affordable and acute ends, some of those regulatory changes and streamlining and entitlements that we're offering to try to help open up supply generally in our marketplace are particularly helpful to our affordable housing providers. So there's regulatory moves you can make, there's the provision of land, making sure that that land is spread around the city, and then having a sort of a pact among your city council that everyone's going to take some so that it's not all in one place, and then defending that. And most of our councillors have stuck to that and can make all of the case that we've just been making here talking on this panel. And so that's our antidote to it is, but it's not perfect. There's still resistance, there's still hesitation, there's still fear. But we also have the track record, and our councillors have seen that the fears are never generally don't manifest if the housing is well run, and particularly if it has the right supports embedded within it. So there's mitigations to all of the fears that tend to manifest, and having a consensus with our councillors around that has been really helpful.
And I want to shift for a second, talk about some of the policies, or at least one that's been highlighted within our campaign platform. And you've mentioned off the top, the campaign's already kind of seen some success. Like housing is an issue, legitimately so in this election. We're seeing a few parties commit to the elimination of chronic homelessness. One of the other successes, if I can call it that we're seeing is that most major parties are made a commitment around seeing the implementation of an Indigenous housing strategy. And which is being, like as I mentioned, addressed by multiple parties. What do you kind of say to or see within the future of addressing the housing needs of Indigenous people in urban, rural, and northern communities? Where do you kind of see that going? Should whichever party get into government implement this Indigenous housing strategy going forward?
Well, not just the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, but particularly Indigenous organizations and leaders have pointed out for some time that the national housing strategy that we've been working with for the last several years, though a huge step forward from a federal silence on housing, still has some very significant gaps when it comes to Indigenous housing, both on reserve, where there's been some movement, and off reserve, where there's a huge need and we haven't seen sufficient movement yet. And particularly on the in cities in the West, we have a large number of Indigenous folks, many of whom are residential school survivors. And so seen through the lens of the education Canadians have had this summer, there's a huge need. And talking to many of the chiefs in Treaty 6 and Treaty 8, where we reside, about the needs of their community members coming to the city, whether it's for education or work, in the absence of culturally safe and supportive housing. So through urban reserve partnerships and other initiatives, we're looking to work much more closely with Indigenous governments and Indigenous-led housing providers to deliver more housing for Indigenous Canadians, particularly living in our cities. And one of the platform commitments released by the Liberals this week speaks to funding a significant initiative around that and co-creating that Indigenous housing strategy. So we've been waiting for that for a long time. Obviously, there's a lot more details to work out, but there are some great providers doing work in our city who are eager to scale up, and the city has made a priority of working with them to see the growth of Indigenous-led housing provision, employment, and supply for communities whose needs haven't been met as Indigenous Canadians come increasingly to our cities in particular.
You talked about supply here, and one of the things that our campaign is going to be talking about in very short order, we've already released it as part of our platform, but tomorrow we're going to put out a video about it, is this concept of financialization, this concept of big banks, hedge funds, REITs kind of purchasing aging affordable housing, converting it, and then effectively pricing out individuals that are living, in those units. How big of a problem do you think financialization is from your perspective? Have you seen it kind of manifest itself in a real way as mayor of Edmonton? And what do you kind of think of federal action on this particular policy ask?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm very curious about what the impacts have been here in Edmonton. I think most of the sort of high-profile cases that have been that have come forward have been in other communities where the real estate market's a little bit hotter. Things because of the economic situation in Alberta aren't under the same sort of speculative pressure that other Canadian markets have been. And so I'm not sure if it's as big an issue here. I am curious about that, but I haven't seen data one way or the other. So it'd be hard to speculate. Clearly, it's an issue in certain Canadian housing markets. And so I'm glad that that's being taken seriously.
You know, as we wrap up with a couple minutes left, I did want to ask you about your sense of optimism going forward. I hear it in your voice. I sense it from your involvement and now continued involvement with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and being on their board going forward. But where's your head at going forward on this issue? Do you feel like we're actually breaking through here in a moment that we might be finding ourselves in? And if so, what's making you optimistic, if the answer is indeed yes, about the future on this file?
Yeah, I think it's sort of the long arc of progress, right? And the movement that I've seen in the platforms of the federal parties over time on this issue. I mean, there's sort of dueling commitments to get to significant outcomes on affordable housing. And I've seen that dogged determination, particularly of the mayors and FCM over time. And I've seen that pay off. So we're not at the finish line yet, but again, we've got a national commitment to end homelessness. That's huge. The next obvious question is, how ambitious are we? When would we like to achieve that? And so the debate is about implementation and ambition. It's not about should we or shouldn't we, right? No one's really saying that anymore. And I think that's transformational for the country, for the sector, for the builders and providers of this housing who do the work on the front lines and actually house the 12,900 people in Edmonton whose lives have been changed. You know, I have deep gratitude for their work. I think it validates their effort over time. And I think that also to the extent that what we talked about a little bit, the issues of reconciliation that have also come to the fore this year. You can't, an ending homelessness conversation in Canada is also a reconciliation conversation at the same time. And so I think the sort of the justice imperative behind that is well aligned, and again, like the business case is too strong not to do this. It's just it's stubbornness, and I realize I'm sort of contradicting myself a little bit because I've gotten to the point of shaming the government of Alberta over their inability to work with cities and the feds over this, because I kind of ran out of tools, right? And that was frustration. And some people then turn around and blame me, say, well, if I'd been nicer to them, maybe they'd have done this. I'm not convinced that that's the case, but I do think it's only a matter of time before we get alignment around this, just because of just the long trajectory that I've seen 14 years working on these issues. So and then I guess the other thing I would say is, notwithstanding that I sort of became the villain for a while last year around the encampments issue, and you know, I was so frustrated and so concerned at one point last fall. I said, you know what, we need a 10-week plan to end homelessness. And people kind of scoffed, but it also created a bit of a hurry up emphasis that we turned our convention center into a shelter. We activated a ton of bridge housing in hotels, and we helped the federal government come to a sense of urgency, and some of that advocacy from the mayors and the conversations I was having at that time led to the Rapid Housing Initiative. And so did we solve it in 10 weeks? No. Did we notch it forward substantially during that time? Yes. And during a point in the winter where it was, you know, minus 40 for 7 or 8 days here, there were folks at the shelter who had never, ever come in out of the cold, as near as we could tell. They weren't in anybody's database. And so for a period of time there, we put a roof over everyone's head. It wasn't a proper home, but we showed that it was possible. So, but as I said, it was the continued pressure from activists, from youth, from Indigenous community leaders, from people concerned about justice and fairness, the relentlessness of that that I think will continue to carry this issue forward. So I am hopeful that there is a societal consensus emerging and that there is a shared sense of urgency around this. And the pandemic has shown us what's possible when we decide to mobilize societal resources to look after each other better. And I don't think we can unlearn that. As divisive and as difficult and as stressful as it's all been, I don't think we can unlearn that.
Yeah, we've seen it and we can't unsee it in that sense. I wanted to end on this question, but I'm getting two really good questions here by Tyler and Tanya, so I'm going to put them together. They're really about accessible housing. We talk about affordable in this conversation. Tyler asked more specifically about the platforms if we've seen accessible housing, and then Tanya asks, what can we do to shift thinking about accessible housing? And would love to hear your perspective on that, Mayor, from your time on City Council regarding the continuum and perhaps where accessible housing fits in it, and how you've been able to make it part of the conversation in Edmonton and leading big city mayors as well.
Yeah, and I see some of the questions in the chat around this, and I think some of the work that we've done around barrier-free housing and universal design is starting to work its way into the building code, which I think is very, very positive. I think the adaptability of housing to meet people's changing needs and life circumstances over time is very appropriate. And I think much of the supportive housing that we've discussed the need for, particularly for folks who are coming off the streets and a long time street involved, often there are a variety of health challenges and mobility challenges. And so universal design is very, very important to, and it's one of the reasons why people say, why is this housing more expensive? And why can't you just convert an apartment tomorrow? And the answer is, well, very often you need to look at mobility and accessibility in either the retrofit or the purpose-built supportive housing. But that's not to say that there aren't broader needs across the housing market, and the inclusion of fully accessible units in more new market developments, as well as certainly in affordable housing projects funded in whole or in part by the public. Inclusionary requirements for universal design are very, very important, and I think the building code moving in that direction is very positive too. But no doubt, housing co-ops, some of the best examples of inclusionary housing here are co-op initiatives where folks have come together with different accessibility needs to make sure that a community is built that is barrier-free. And that has supports built in as well. And so I think supportive housing and barrier-free housing can take a lot of different configurations, and that certainly for folks with mobility needs, that it makes a lot of sense to ensure that every housing is as barrier-free as possible, but certainly that publicly funded affordable housing, whether it's retrofitted or new, includes units that are barrier-free for people. So that's a very important point. I appreciate people have raised that in the chat.
Mayor, on behalf of all of our partners at Vote Housing, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, the Canadian Lived Experience Leadership Network, and the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your public service, for everything that you've done. Thank you for your compassion and thoughtfulness on this file in particular, and your leadership on it across the country. And what I will say is thank you to everyone as well for joining this conversation. As the mayor has said, we know we've got a solid moral case. We know we've got the solid business case. It's now ensuring that the political case and the political will for political parties and whoever ends up forming government continues to be there. And that is our responsibility, to ensure that that business and moral case continues to be pushed through policy and in our case, nonpartisan politics, as we try to ensure that this is an issue that receives the right attention, the right policy solutions, and investment of time and attention. So thank you to you, Mayor, and thank you to everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your evening. Take care, everyone. Take care.